Dear students, welcome to Darasa Online. My name is Mr. Darcy. I teach English Language 1. The lesson is on morphology, the subtopic which is under the major topic called word formation. Morphology is the study of the structure of a word in a language. In this lesson, we'll be guided by a question that in all the time we'll be trying to see how we can go about that question in response to morphology. And the guiding question goes like, the question reads, how can you divide a word into syllables? So this question needs us later on to know and see how a word can be broken into small pieces. In that case, our concentration will be on the structure of words. How a word has been built up. We all understand that whether it being spoken and or written, a word has to have units. They could be letters and they could be sounds. In this study, sometimes, somewhere, we'll find ourselves talking about both sounds and letters. But mostly, we'll have to look at the structure in terms of how a word is written, and thereafter, how can you divide that word depending on the elements that we are going to see. In understanding the structure of a word in a language, we need to know how the word is built. So from the way how a word is built, you will never run away of understanding what a root could be or what a root is. And then after root, we'll see something more than it or something bigger than it, which is a base. And then we'll talk about the stem, and finally we'll talk about affixes, which when you understand all these elements, you finally find yourself that you can divide a word the way you want and the way you are directed to. Beginning with a root. A root, it is said to be a basic part of a word. Basic part in a sense that it is the part of a word that carries the idea or that carries the meaning that a word wishes to present. It is the part of the word through which other words can be built in. So in this case, when we talk about a root, it is an element that you cannot further segment it without destroying its meaning. And if you omit either a syllable or a letter or whatever from a root, that means the meaning which was supposed to be presented by a root will be distorted. And you might have something which does not exist in a language. Let us have an example. You have this word nation. You have this word boy. You can have even another word like walk. These words by themselves, They are roots. They carry the basic part of a word. Or you cannot remove any of these letters before you destroy the meaning of what has been presented. But you can have other example of roots like wrapped, meet, scribe, and other more. Now, when you read these, wrapped, meet, and scribe, you might get some difficulties to understand what could these elements mean. They are also considered to be roots. What I wanted us to know is when you talk about a root, you can have roots which are recognized as words in a language. But you can also have other roots which are not recognized as a word. So whether it's a word or part of a word, as long as it carries the meaning of what is supposed to be presented, or as long as it carries the basic part of a word from which other words can be built up, then that becomes a root. We call these as roots because it is part of a word which seems to be shared by different other words. If you think about this root, you can have a base formed from that root being corrupt. And or you can have another base which is formed by the same root called abrupt. So corrupt and abrupt, they are sharing the same element. The same as with this meat. You can have submit, you can have permit as well. This element seems to have been shared by different bases. We call them roots which are not recognizable as words. So at time when you are to identify a root from a word, you have to ask yourself, has this element been shared by other words, or it is something in common only for a particular word? When you have this situation, then you know that it is something that is not shared. But again, it should not be confused when you have a word like walking and you have another word like talking. That you might think probably there are some elements or some letters that, as you can see, they are resembling. It should not tempt you in any way talking about these letters become roots. For example, as you can see, all these parts of these words, they're almost the same. But we have the ing as an element being attached. So anything attached, it cannot in any way be part of the root. So think about the other part, like walk and talk. Now, it is only the first letters that they differ. Walk, talk. Now, what if a person says it is ALK, these are letters that they are shared between the two words? Can this be a root? The answer becomes no. Because a root by itself, once you have to have a base whatever it should be added, it has to be a syllable by itself. A syllable, we will see it later, that it's a unit of pronunciation. So W or this T, it's not a syllable because you cannot pronounce it by itself. So this is what and how you can identify a root. Remember, a root can be shared by two different word bases. Sometimes root is not shared. The second element is a base. Base, it is a word. It is a word which is meaningful by itself. It is something which is recognized. It's an element. If you are to segment it, of course, you can have further segmentation. We'll see it later when it comes to syllable division. But how can we identify a base from other words? A base is a word before it receives any attachment. In other words, you can as well say that a base, it is a word that has a possibility of accepting both inflectional attachment and or derivational attachment. When you can have an example like this word. Now, think about these three words. These are said to be good examples of a base. That this word, it has a possibility of accepting the inflection affix. It can as well have a possibility of accepting the derivation affix. So in this case, this word kind qualifies to be a base. The word organ, it's also a base. Similarly with the word play, where at this point you can have plays, you can talk about player, you can talk about played, and many more other attachments. Organ, you can talk about organs, organization, organize, and so forth. So as long as we have a word being able to accept inflectional and derivational, that word becomes a base. When I talk about inflectional and derivational, I simply mean that an attachment, either at the end or at the beginning, once it changes the word class, that becomes a derivational. But if it doesn't change the word class, that becomes inflectional. So for this reason, as per these examples, the element S, when it was attached to a word play, it hasn't changed the word class, and therefore we refer this as inflection attachment. Differently from the ER, once it has been attached to the word play, it changes the word from being a verb to become a noun. And so the ER there, it acts as a derivational affix. So this is a base. If I may give you more example like yeah. Someone said disorganized. When I ask you of which element you can identify here as a base, I would definitely have to think about making some segmentation to see what could be part of this word that before it starts receiving any attachment. Here, we'll take off the first element, this, we'll as well take off the last element, and we'll have to remain, we'll have to remain with the former one, like the previous, as we have discussed. That is a base. Stem. Stem. Stem is a bit different from a base, where when you are to understand what a stem is, you also need to have words. But what part of a word form a stem? So it's a word by itself that can be a stem. But how do you understand that this is a stem and not a base? It says that stem is a word that receives only one attachment, which is inflection 1. I repeat, that stem is a word that has a possibility of receiving inflectional attachment only. Once a word has a possibility of accepting derivational attachment, then that word cannot qualify to be a stem. For example, we had a word player. So this word player, it qualifies to be a stem. Why and how? It qualifies to be a stem simply because when we think of adding, or when we think about attaching an element either at the end and or at the beginning, what we are going to have is, it is only the inflection S that can be accepted, and not any other type of attachment that can be accepted. So in that reason, we call this word as a stem. We failed to call a word play as a stem only because it has that possibility of accepting the ER. Once that word has that possibility, it is referred back as a base. So if we are to think about other examples like the word kind, is the word kind a stem? Is it a stem? The answer becomes no. Why? Because the word kind had the possibility of accepting the ly, which this is said to be a derivational attachment, or this is said to be a derivational affix. So in that case, we need all the time to have our mind being focused by what kind of an attachment a word receives. If the word has a possibility of receiving both inflectional and derivational, that definitely is grouped under bases. But if it has a possibility of accepting only one attachment, which is inflectional, we call it a stem. So at time, when you look at a stem, a base, and a root, they might somehow look like you're talking about the same thing. But this, of course, you can make it more elaborative, like root and a base, because at a time, when you think about what part of a word could be a base, it is the same thing that you can come up as an example of a what? Of a root. Though, in some other words, a root cannot be a base. So we need to be very, very careful which kind of words can be root and at the same time can be a base, and which kind of words can be roots and not being a base. That should not be confused. The first element that we need us to discuss before we start looking at how a word can be divided is about affixes. Affixes are elements that need to be attached. In simple other words, some other people call it bound morphemes. They can be attached either at the beginning or at the end of a word. It depends. Now, these affixes, basically, they are of two categories. You talk about those which, when they are attached, they change only the meaning, but they don't change the word class. But we have those other affixes. Once they are attached to a word, they do change the word class and the meaning as well. With this, we have to refer the two types or the two categories as inflectional and derivational affixes. The inflectionals are those which, when you attach, they don't change the word class, but the derivational are those when you attach, they do change the word class. If I have to have more other examples like of the inflection affixes, I would think of, let's say, a word like play, attaching the ed, a word like tall, attaching the er, the word like boy, attaching the s, boys. All those reflect inflection attachment. If I have to think, on the other hand, like the er, talk of a word like organize, talk of a word like happiness, and many more others. These are said to be derivational attachment because when you have a word play as a verb, attaching the er, it makes it a noun. Organ is a noun, attaching the ise, it changes to become a verb. Happy is an adjective, attaching ness, it changes to become a noun. So, with such kind of an attachment, it makes a word change from one word class to another word class. So, having understood these elements, it now becomes our task to see how can we divide words into syllables. How can we divide words into syllables? Because now we know that we have elements in a word. So if we are to divide a word into a syllable, you'll definitely need to know as well what is a syllable. How does a syllable look like? So if you know how it looks like, it becomes easier for you to say, oh, these words or these elements, they form a syllable by themselves. Now, a syllable, whether it being written and or spoken, in short, we call it a unit of pronunciation. It's a unit of pronunciation. And it is easy to recognize a syllable when we speak. Because a unit of pronunciation, it is part of a word, or it's a word which you pronounce it at once. or it is pronounced as a single element. But when we write, it is difficult to say that I write it as a single part or as a single element. That's why we say it is very easy to recognize a syllable when we speak. And if you remember, sometimes at the beginning I said, in this discussion, we'll find ourselves sometimes that we are incorporating the two, the speaking and the writing. And especially when it comes to a syllable. So, structurally, a syllable is made up structurally, a syllable is made up with a vowel sound together with a consonant sound or consonant sounds. But this structure of a syllable is not necessary that a syllable can as well be made up with consonant sounds. In simple terms, we talk about a vowel sound. A vowel sound is always a nucleus of a syllable. So when we are trying, or when we are to identify a syllable, our focus all the time should be on the vowels. And here, I'm not talking about a vowel as a letter. I'm talking about a vowel as a sound. For example, look at this word, blood. It is a word made up or having two vowel letters. But if I have to ask myself, how many syllables does the word have? I will end up saying the word has one syllable, despite having two vowel letters. If I have to pronounce this, it will read like this, blood. So you have only one vowel sound. When you talk about a word like this, air, if someone asks you how many syllables does this word have, you'll again end up saying this word also has only one syllable because it is made up with only one vowel sound. Air. The question there could be, how can you tell us that this word has been made up with one vowel sound while there are two? Remember, in your study of speaking, and especially the vowel phonemes, you had the diphthongs and the monophthongs. This is an example of a diphthong. So when we are looking at the nuclear part of a syllable, we don't have to forget that there are some vowel sounds which are made up with two unit vowel system, the diphthongs. And you have those others which are made up with one unit system, which are the monophthongs. So this is one of the other things that you need also to know. Think about a word like script. How many syllables do you have there? Again, you have one syllable. If you are to pronounce this again, you'll find ending up with having these sounds. When you look at all those, it's only E, which is a vowel there. So with these few examples, I wanted us to know that no matter how many consonant phonemes that you have in a word, those cannot qualify a syllable. It is only a vowel phoneme that makes a syllable in a word. So all these words are referred as monosyllabic words. Look at this word, language. How many syllables do you have there? As I said, don't be tempted by looking at the spelling of a word. That could probably tell you how many vowel letters that you have. That would be wrong. Try to look at how it is pronounced. So for this one, for instance, one can pronounce this as language. Now, if you count the number of vowels, you realize that there are 2 vowel phonemes, which altogether, the whole word seemed to have 2 syllables. How do you pronounce it? It is language. Language. So if you pronounce the word slowly, there at times you seem to put like some short break when you pronounce it. So it is language. So lang, that becomes a syllable by itself, and guid becomes a syllable by itself. So it is at this point where I wanted us now to think about how can you divide a word into syllable. So in this case, this word language is divided somewhere here. It becomes easy when you pronounce it. But when it comes to the normal spelling, what do? Think about this word again. How do you pronounce this? Again, this is English. How many vowels? 1, 2. So the word again has 2 syllables. The first syllable starts from the beginning and it ends somewhere there. English. Now, let's observe one or 2 more other examples, like look at this word. How do you pronounce it? That is hospitality. It is hospitality. And where do I put my syllabic division? Of course, hos. The first syllable, it ends here. Hos. Pit. Al. Iti. So it is hospitality. That's how we can make this syllabic division. But under normal spelling, this is where now you'll have to relate the way you pronounce and the places where you think that word can be divided. Language. So this one, the first syllable, it is this one. English. English. The first syllable, it is this one. Hospitality. Then you have hos, pit, al, e, t. That is what and how it goes. It is a bit somehow difficult for people to identify a syllable in some English words, and especially those who have Kiswahili background. You know, in Kiswahili, identifying a syllable is very easy because what you know is that a syllable normally ends with a vowel, which we always call them open syllables. In a word that has only one syllable, there's no problem because it is a monosyllabic word. But for those words which have many syllables, how do you make this syllabic division? It is for you being able to pronounce that word slowly. The places where you think you can put some short pauses as you pronounce the word, those are the area where you have to make these syllabic divisions. But when we are writing, the normal spelling, the orthography of a word, how can it help you to know this is a place where I can make my syllabic division? Of course, by our bare eyes, it is difficult. It is only until you pronounce the word that can give you a clue. And if it happens that you know how to pronounce like this, it becomes more beneficial. It becomes more important. Because there's a time those vowel phonemes can give you a clue where should you have to make your divisions. It is said that there are some vowel phonemes which when you have them as nuclear in a syllable, they cannot be left open. They must be closed. They're said to be restricted, that they are restricted to be left open. For example, you have such vowel phonemes as this one, as this one, as that one, and as this one. We have about 4 vowel phonemes which are said to be restricted. When you have establish, the word establish, it becomes easy for a person to divide this word into its syllables if a person can pronounce this word correctly and pronouncing it again with some short pauses in between these syllables. How do you pronounce the word? The word is pronounced as establish. So if you are to pronounce it slowly, you'll find the first syllable start with I and ends with S. So it is is, and then you have this vowel, which, as I said, it is one among the restricted vowel that cannot be left open, and therefore it has to be closed by the followed consonant, which is B. So it has to read as establish. But under its normal spelling, as we said, that a person might get some difficulties since the way we pronounce the word is not exactly the way we write. And therefore, if I have to pronounce following this formative, I would start having is, tab, lish. And so this is how we go about looking on the restricted vowels, on how we can handle them when we come across with them in a word. Have the word education. Now think about these words. How can you divide these words into syllables? Education. As I said, it becomes easy when you are able to pronounce it. When you pronounce it slowly, you will be making some short pauses in between the word. Looking at the word as it spells, it won't be able, or it won't be easy for you to divide the word. If I may to help the first example, I will talk about age, under normal spelling, it will read like this one. If I have to pronounce this, it would read something like this. Education. Now this E, this this E, as it is one of the restricted, then we can't left it open, then it has to be closed by the followed sound, edge. This one remains by itself, this one, and so it reads education. Think about the followed word. How do you divide it? I may help you to pronounce the word, but where do you make its syllabic division? Academic. It is academic. This one, of course, if you are in Britain, you talk about magazine, not magazine as you're in America. That is magazine, magazine. Because this is date, and this is data. How many syllables do you have in each of these words? Try to pronounce. Don't look at the way a word spells. Look at the way it is pronounced. The most important thing as to why we have to study this syllabic division is that it helps us sometimes during writing. When we write, we don't just write continuously as we go. We have pages where when you reach at the end of the page, maybe there's a small space that you want to write a word but it's not enough, then that's where you have to know that word has to be divided by its syllable and not you just cut it anywhere. At the end of a syllable, that is where you have to divide the word, but not anywhere else. That's the important reason as to why people have to study syllabic division. And so with this, I believe now that I have given you some clues and some hints on how, when you are given a word, to know where exactly you have to make this syllabic division. But before we leave, I would want us to go back to those elements that we saw when we were identifying the structure of a word, for us to see if we can memorize or if we can remember whatever we have discussed. Let's see the text which is in front of you. Have a minute to read about the text. My life changed rapidly and repeatedly. I went to Buffalo as an assistant professor and was promoted twice, living as a full professor with tenure and administrative responsibility for graduate program in health education. When I left Buffalo, I had published more than 40 articles in professional journals, and my second book was soon to come off the presses. During my tenure at Buffalo, I appeared on radio and television programs and was the subject of numerous newspaper articles. In Buffalo, I bought my first house, fathered my 2 children, and won my first tennis tournament. In short, I became success. The structure of words in a language. Now, if I may take you a bit back, on word categories, we have major word classes and we have minor word classes. Under major word class, this is where we have those words that can accept attachment, where we can have the base, we can have the stem, and definitely, of course, we have roots. Differently from minor word classes where at this we are expecting to have words which do not receive attachments. So in this case, we can only have roots under the minor word classes, but we cannot think about having the attachments. So back to the texts. I want you to identify root of different words. I want you to identify basis of words that we see. I want you as well to identify stem. I lastly want you to identify the affixes and say if they are inflectional affixes and or if they are derivational affixes. If I may help in the first sentence, the word my is under minor word class, which in these elements identification, I could only say that is a root. It does not have any attachment. The word life is under major word class, and it's a noun. It doesn't have any attachment. The word changed, that word is under major word class. It has an attachment. The attachment in the word changed, it is the element D, which in this case, it is an affix. Now, in which category out of these two you place it under inflectional, as long as it has not changed the word class from it being a verb to become any other word class. So it is a verb and it results to a verb after the addition. The word rapidly, it is under major word class. You have the root, which is the word rapid, and you have the attachment ly. The question there comes, is ly an inflection affix and or a derivational? The answer is that is a derivational one. So again, the word rapid is a base. The word and is under minor word class, so no attachment. And what about repeatedly? Comes from the word repeat. It has the ed attachment. Is it inflection or derivational? Lastly, it has ly as an attachment. Is it the inflection or a derivational? Think about the remaining other words. How do you categorize them? And at the end of the day, try to check how many syllables do these words have. If they have been made up with one syllable, say it. If they have been made up with more than one syllable, say it. And check your ability. Can you make this syllabic division just as we did when I was trying to demonstrate on those other examples? Now, a Swahili speaker would always face some difficulties in making syllabic division, especially when he or she deals with English words. And these difficulties, they are caused by the inconsistency of how a word is pronounced and the way it is written. For example, all the Swahili syllables are open syllables, structurally. But when it comes to English language, the syllables can either be open and or can be closed. So having a closed syllable, that a syllable that ends with a consonant, something which doesn't exist in Kiswahili. And so a Swahili speaker, once he or she comes across with a syllable that ends with a consonant, he or she will tend to put a vowel at the end so that a syllable would sound similar to those of the Kiswahili language. Again, you might come across with an English word, and especially a syllable you're talking about, that having a cluster of consonants. When I say a cluster of consonants, which means that there are consonants which follow one another without a vowel in between. So when we have such kind of a combination, then a Swahili speaker normally faces some difficulties, and in that case, he or she will tend to insert a vowel in between. So in that case, we find that this Swahili speaker, when they come across with such kind of syllables, they are getting some difficulties to make this identification. But all in all, what we need to know is that it is the lack of one-to-one relationship between the spelling and the pronunciation that English language has in comparison to Kiswahili language, which it has a direct relationship between the way how a word is written and the way how the word is pronounced. What I want us to remember is that when we are making syllabic division, our concentration should not be on how a word is written, but it has to be on how a word is pronounced. And as I said before, that when we pronounce a word, especially that one which has more than one syllable, when you pronounce it, you find there are short breaks that you put in between. And in those areas where you put those short breaks, those are the areas where you have to make the syllabic divisions. Thank you very much for listening. Keep on watching Darasa Online.